Hey everyone. Have you ever had a situation in which you thought you knew, you could clearly see the options about what God could do? Maybe you prayed about it and you thought, well, Lord, there's this or there's this, and I'm kind of hoping you'll do this. Maybe you could see just these two options and no others. And then when you pray, God does something completely unexpected. He had a third option that you never even saw, hadn't noticed, couldn't understand. God uses unusual methods to accomplish his goals. His methods and timing are not ours, not at all. And we can't put God in a box or define the parameters of what he can do. He busts all the boxes that we try to create. Some of his ways are downright strange to us. He might use visions or dreams. He could do things the opposite way we think is logical and possible. I remember once looking at a particular couple that the wife had the gospel shared with her many times by a friend, and she seemed to be interested. And we all thought, Lori's going to become a Christian, and then through her husband's going to become a believer too. That's not what happened. Instead, her husband, his gambling addiction got the better of him, and he ended up wrecking his marriage and ended up in rehab. And she had gotten kind of bitter toward him and turned away. But in rehab, he came to know the Lord, and his changed life reached her eventually. It was completely backwards to what I thought God was going to do. We know God does not do evil. He does not cause wrong to happen, but he can and does use the evil done by others for his own ends. Perhaps you've heard the name Susan Atkins. Susan was a member of the Charles Manson family. She participated in the horrible murders that group committed in the home of actress Sharon Tate. And Susan originally got the death sentence for her part in those murders. Later, her death sentence was commuted to life in prison. And while in prison, Susan became a believer in Jesus. God did not cause the evil, but he did use it, and he used it for her salvation. It's strange, right? God's timing is usually not ours either. His idea of how long something should take is usually not mine, and I am betting you've had that experience as well. But though timing and methods of God are not predictable, the outcome is, because if God says something, if he promises something, then he will certainly complete what he promised. The outcome is sure, although the methods might be unexpected or surprising. Now we're starting the book of 2 Samuel this week. David has been learning about the methods and the timing of God, but he knows the end towards which God is moving. David has known that he would be king over all of Israel. He's known that for some time, but he doesn't know when. And he doesn't know how God's going to do it. Up until now, God's timing has been slow, and his methods are unusual, and that seems to be the way it continues in this passage. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, David learns about the death of King Saul and Jonathan, his old, much-loved friend, in battle. He learns this when an Amalekite shows up in his camp, and this guy found Saul dead on Mount Gilboa, found Saul wearing his crown, apparently, and this guy took the crown and the armband off the body of Saul and went to David with what he thought was going to be good news, that Saul is dead. David's old enemy is dead. The road is open for David to take the throne. Or is it? This guy concocts a plan to get into the good books of David. Maybe he was hoping to make David think that David owes this guy something. Maybe he's hoping for a position of power in David's kingdom in exchange for what he tells David he has done. Now, what he tells David isn't true. When he found Saul, Saul was dead. It's clear from the end of 1 Samuel that Saul threw himself on his own sword and died. But this guy tells David that Saul was still alive when he found him. He said Saul had asked him to end his life since he was wounded. And this Amalekite said he did kill Saul, and he thinks David is going to thank him for that. David says, "Aren't you afraid to lift your hand against the one the Lord has anointed?" He then commands the man to kill this guy for killing Saul. Then David writes a lament for Saul and for Jonathan, and he shows a lot of grace and kindness here. No proclamations of being glad that Saul is gone. No whining about how he's been treated by Saul. Instead, in verses 17 to 24, he speaks of the might of Saul and Jonathan in battle. They are mighty warriors. His lament elevates the man who sought for all those years to take David's life. This says so much about the character of David. He is so in tune with the heart of God. In verses 25 to 27, David focuses on his friend Jonathan. He speaks of how much he had loved Jonathan, and he mourns for his friend. David shows a lot of understanding of the value of a human life. He shows grace in focusing on what is good about Saul. David acknowledged the good things Saul has done for the nation. No celebration of his death, but mourning as if for a friend. David really reflects the heart of God in this. He knows God put Saul on the throne, and he doesn't support anyone taking Saul off by violence. He is willing to wait God's timing on how things work out. He is so at peace with the methods that God will choose and the timing of God that he is not fretting about the outcome. He is able to see the big picture and reflect the heart of God toward the death of Saul and of Jonathan. So the first teaching point, confidence in God's plans allows a believer to treat others with grace. Confidence in God's plans allows a believer to treat others with grace. I don't know about you, but this is not how I would respond if my enemy was dead after he had chased me all around the wilderness for years on end. I don't have this level of grace. It kind of astonishes me. How do you respond when someone who has hurt you is hurt? Do you feel vindicated? Do you kind of feel as if they got what was coming to them? Or do you value their humanity and mourn for their pain? The only way to value the humanity of your enemy, to see the good in them and sincerely mourn when trouble comes to them, is by fully trusting the plans, the timing, and the methods of God. David trusted that God had a good plan and that all that he had suffered at the hands of Saul was part of God's preparation of David for the throne. So David is able to see Saul with eyes of grace and kindness. Who in your life has hurt you? What would your response be if they were hurt? Do you uphold the good in them in spite of what they've done? Or do you throw them under the bus completely because of what they did that you did not like? Or what they did that hurt you? Be honest with yourself, if not with anyone else. Be honest with God. Ask God to help you trust him enough that you can see them with kindness and grace instead of with vengeance. Trust him that he is using his unusual methods for good in your life. So with Saul dead and Jonathan the crown prince also gone, and with the other two warrior sons of Saul dead, the road to the throne of Israel seems to be open for David, but he does not rush forward. He goes to God. Let's have a look at 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered him. Now, Judah is the tribal territory of David, and Hebron is in the territory of Judah. So David is asking if he should go home. He doesn't make a beeline to where Saul has been reigning as king, but he asks the Lord if he ought to return home to Israel, to his tribal territory. And the Lord not only says yes, but directs him to a specific town, to Hebron. So David goes there with his wives and his men and their families, and the men of Judah come out and they make David king. Now, I think a couple of things are implied here. First, it's widely known that God has proclaimed David king over the whole of the nation, over Israel. Even the Amalekite, who came and brought the news of the death of Saul, knew that David was supposed to be the next king. Secondly, there seems to be a power vacuum in Israel at this moment. It seems as there's no king has automatically stepped up to the throne in the place of Saul. Judah hears that David has come, and they go and make him king, but they make him king only over their tribe, only over Judah. David begins his reign by sending a message to the town of Jabesh Gilead. They're the ones that took the bodies of Saul and his sons down off the walls of Beth-shan. And David commends them for that act, and he says that he wants God to show them kindness. For this act of kindness to the king that David is someday going to replace. And then he tells them that he has been made king over Judah. You see, trust in God means waiting his timing and moving only on his command. David wisely waits on God when the way seems open. By human wisdom, he should have plowed ahead and taken the entire nation, but he asked God where to go and what to do, and God answered. God directed him, and David humbly obeyed. He knows the final goal of God, and this seems like the time, but David doesn't assume. He moves with God, and he leaves the timing to God. Do you wait, or do you rush in when the way seems clear? How frustrated do you get when the timing of God is not yours? Now, I know that has been hard for me in the past. I want God to hurry up already and get going on what he seems to be calling me to do. And instead, he used the time that I felt was wasted in waiting to equip me for what lay ahead. How do you respond to uncertain timing? Do you turn to God first for the direction, or after you've moved and found out it didn't work out? In what current situation are you struggling to wait patiently? What would make it hard for you to follow the example of David and seek God's direction and timing and only move when he tells you to? Habakkuk 2 verse 3, for the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. Faith in God includes faith in his timing. Now begins a time of war. Again, war. David just never seems free of it. War this time is between the house of David in Judah and the house of Saul. At this point, Abner seems to be the power in Israel. Abner was a cousin of King Saul and the commander of the army of Saul, and he takes Ishbosheth, one of Saul's sons, and makes him king. It's unclear why Ishbosheth didn't automatically step up to the throne. Is he quite young still? He was apparently not in battle with Saul and his other sons. Maybe he wasn't a warrior. Maybe he wasn't old enough to go to battle. We're not really sure. But at any rate, it implies that there's a fair bit of power here in the hands of Abner. Now, as part of this conflict, men of the armies of Ishbosheth under Abner and the men of David under his commander Joab meet in Gibeon, and they decide to do some man-to-man competition. Each side picks 12 men, and David is not there. And the men face off, and each one kills his opponent. So each battling pair, all of the men die. All 24 of them die. And the whole thing spirals then into a full-on battle. And in the end, David's army wins. Now, Joab is the commander of David's army, and Joab is David's nephew. And he is there with his brothers, Abishai and Asahel. Now, the battle ends. Abner is leaving, and Asahel, who is a very fast runner, is running after Abner. Asahel has no weapons. Abner calls back and tells Asahel to stop and get a weapon. Abner seems to feel it's not a fair contest. He's armed and Asahel is not. But Asahel won't stop. Asahel seems to draw very near, and finally Abner just stabs backwards with the butt of his spear behind him and impales Asahel, who dies right there. Now this is war. They've just been in battle. This is kind of part of the pursuit of the battle. Saul's men have been defeated. And Abner did not kill out of personal hatred here. He warned Asahel to get a weapon. But Joab and Abishai are filled with vengeance over the death of their brother, and they chase after Abner. And Abner calls back and says, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their brothers?" And that caused Joab to cease pursuing Abner, and he called off his men. But the conflict is not really ended. Further battles come along. David's army is stronger than the army of Ishbosheth. And during this time, 6 sons are born to David while he reigns in Hebron. He reigns there for 7 years. Abner is very powerful in the kingdom of Ishbosheth. Out of the blue, however, Ishbosheth accuses Abner of sleeping with a concubine of Saul. Her name was Rizpah. Now, this is a big deal in the ancient world. To sleep with the concubine or the wife of a dead king is in essence to be laying claim to everything that belonged to that king. It is a claim to the throne. And Abner is absolutely furious at the accusation because he didn't do this. He has been loyal to the son of his cousin Saul. So he's very angry at the accusation. We're going to read a few verses out of chapter 3, starting in verse 9. Where is verse 9 starting? May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. Ishbosheth did not dare to say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. Abner has a lot of influence. He has power to deliver the kingdom to David. And clearly he knows that David is the king of God's choosing. He has been therefore resisting the plan of God by putting Ishbosheth on the throne. But now he says he's going to give Israel to David. Abner sends a message to David saying that he's going to turn over the nation and asking for a peace agreement between them. David says, fine, but Abner has to do one thing first. He has to give back Michal, which is David's wife, who has been taken and given to another man. He sends a message to Ishbosheth demanding his wife, and Ishbosheth seems to be afraid enough to obey. So Michal is sent back to David with her current husband trailing behind her weeping. That must have been quite the scene. Abner then goes to the leaders of the nation and he says, for a long time you've wanted David as king, so go for it. Let's do it. And he goes to the elders of Benjamin specifically, because that's the tribe of King Saul, and talks to them too. And then he goes to David and he comes to an agreement in which he's going to turn the nation over to David. And David sends him away from that discussion in peace, with a peace treaty between them. Now Joab comes and hears about this, and he's not so interested in Abner turning over the nation to David. He's not interested in what is best for his king, David. He is not interested in what is best for the nation. He only has his eyes on one thing, and that is revenge. Revenge for the death of his brother Asahel, who died in battle. And Joab says David is foolish to trust Abner. He says David is being deceived and Abner can't be trusted. In spite of the peace treaty, Joab goes after Abner with a mind set on revenge. He takes actions of war in a time of peace. He pretends he has a message from David, and he gets close to Abner, who is trusting in the peace treaty. And Joab stabs Abner so that he dies. Now, I don't know if you noticed where this took place. It took place at the gate of Hebron. David is reigning in Hebron. Abner has been to visit David. Joab waited till Abner was outside the city gates of Hebron before he got him to stop and speak to him. He did this on purpose because Hebron is a city of refuge. If someone has taken the life of another person and they're in the city of refuge, they are free from the avenger of blood. Now, the avenger of blood issue should not even have come up here because Asahel's death was in battle, and this is a time of peace. But Joab's not justified in pursuing this, but he doesn't care. So Joab caught Abner at the gate. He certainly knew the value that God put on human life, and he violated the spirit of the law of the city of refuge, if not the letter. And Joab is bent on revenge, and he uses deception to get it. David is furious with Joab. David says he is innocent of the death of Abner, and he speaks a curse on the house of Joab. David made all his people tear their clothes in sorrow and mourn Abner. He forced Joab to walk with the funeral bier of Abner, mourning. David himself followed Abner's body, weeping, and David wrote and sang a lament over Abner. In the lament, he calls Joab wicked. Everyone sees how David felt about the death of Abner and understands that he was not at fault in his death. Ishbosheth is afraid when he learns that Abner is dead. Then 2 men who work for him, leading his raiding parties, turn on him, betray him, and kill him while he's resting one afternoon in his room. They cut off his head, and then they go to David in Hebron, and they think David will be glad to hear their news. We're going to pick up in chapter 4, in the middle of verse 8. Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring. Now again, people seem to know God's plan, but they don't know God's methods or timing, and they don't know the heart of God. They use human wisdom, but David understands these human methods are not God's way. And David says, didn't you hear what I did to the person who told me that he'd killed Saul, thinking he brought me good news? How much worse is it what you have done, putting to death an innocent man in his own bed? So David orders these men killed for the execution of Ishbosheth. Then the head of Israel's king is buried in the tomb of Abner. There is a deliberate contrast between David's response to the death of Saul with the revenge of Joab and the betrayal of the men who killed Ishbosheth in his bed. David is depending on God. The others are using human wisdom and are driven either by revenge or greed. God approves the behavior of David. He does not approve the behavior of these other men, but God does use their evil to advance his plans. He did not need them to do evil to accomplish his purposes, but he did use it. His methods are odd and unexpected, but the outcome is a sure thing. God uses unexpected means to accomplish his sure purposes. What purpose of God for your life is known to you? Perhaps God has revealed to you some ministry he has for you, or has called you to some specific area of service, but you're waiting, not just sure when or how God is going to bring this to pass. I was in that spot for 4.5 years, from the time God first broached to me the idea of being a teaching leader in BSF until he actually brought it about. And I was often totally confused as to the methods God was using, and his timing was really not what I thought it would be. But the time wasn't wasted. God eventually did what he said he was going to do. Perhaps you are in that situation. What characteristics of God are you clinging to regarding his sovereignty over his purposes for you? And how can you settle your heart as you wait for his timing or struggle to understand his methods? Is there a situation in which you're in danger of putting God in a box, of believing that you know all the options by which God could solve your particular problem? It's easy to understand, or to underestimate rather, the methods of God and the ways of God. It's often hard to see how God is using these strange and unexpected methods that he tends to do. I'm sure David had times of uncertainty and confusion, but David trusted God. He did what was right. He asked God for direction. He refused to take revenge. He refused to pursue the purposes of God by his own power or in his own wisdom or his own timing. In what situation today do you need to follow that example? We can safely leave things in the hands of God. He can be trusted. He will do what is right and good. His unusual methods and his unexpected timing are not reasons to stop trusting or to cease to follow his direction. Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. And Job 23:10, he knows the way I should take.